I guess I should say, please be seated. Good morning. It's an honor to be here to share my story with you today and to reflect with you on the profound meanings and significance of identity. I'm an Indian. That's the most important truth I would like to share with you today. I Am an Indian was the title of one of the first books I read as a young adult that held up and affirmed an identity that for many people was only one to be denigrated, denied, and forgotten. So my reflection this morning will look at the history of being an Indian, what it used to mean, what it's coming to mean now, and what that means for all of us. In order to do that, we need to look into the past and trace the journey that brought us here. So let's go back. There were a number of treaties and other agreements signed in the centuries and decades before Confederation that set a certain tone, a sense that what was being established was a relationship between nations. Then, after the War of 1812, which of course Canada won, no matter what the Americans say, this context began to change. By the mid-19th century, the focus began to be more on civilizing the Indians and assimilating them into the Canadian Christian mainstream. An act to encourage the gradual civilization of the Indian tribes in the province was passed by the Province of Canada in 1857. It was one of the first attempts to use government policy to assimilate Indians into the economic and social customs of European settler society. And it set the precedent for further laws, like the Gradual Enfranchisement Act of 1869, which was designed to wean Indians from what was seen as their savage state and make them part of the colonial society. I'm going to talk more about enfranchisement a bit later on, but we'll just say for now that it meant giving up Indian rights and status in order to become a Canadian citizen. These acts and other pieces of British legislation would be consolidated under the Indian Act of 1876. I think it's important to note that the Indian Act is a fairly unique piece of legislation in the world. It's the only one of its kind I know of, that is to say, a relic from a period of colonial domination and assimilationist objectives that remains largely unchanged today. The question that most often arises for me in discussion with non-Indigenous Canadians is why the heck we still have this horrible piece of legislation on the books. But before I try to answer that, though, I'll raise the question that sticks most in my mind as I contemplate the Indian Act. And that is, why did Canada feel the need, more than just about any other country, and certainly more than any of the other enlightened democracies of the world? Why did Canada feel the need to subjugate an entire people so completely, to press its knee so firmly on the neck of individual Indians, as well as on their families, communities, nations, and governments? It's a question we must all look deeply within ourselves to answer. And given the Church's complicity in that genocidal project through the residential schools, it's a question with particular relevance for everyone here today. But let us return to the Indian Act. Despite its egregious, racist command and control, it does include certain obligations that Canada must meet. Many First Nations leaders are not prepared to dismantle the Indian Act until the provisions that hold Canada to account are clearly laid out, albeit in more equitable and progressive ways in some new legislation. And I should also point out that the vast majority of communities still operate as Indian Act bands, and some of them will say that they've made the Indian Act work for them, so are not necessarily interested in change. The Indian Act also sets out who an Indian actually is. The colonial government began to keep records of Indians as early as 1851 to know who was entitled to benefits under treaty. In 1951, the current Indian Register was put in place at the Department of Indian Affairs, and it's still the central inventory of all band lists. So the way it works is that if your ancestors were on one of those lists and they had a category of status that could be passed on, you can claim Indian status. You may hear terms like blood quantum, but those don't apply in Canada. It is really only dependent on whether you can trace a family line from an earlier status Indian. The Indian Act also controlled people's individual lives in ways that many of us could not imagine. Indians were prohibited from buying liquor or ammunition, from entering pool halls, and in a policy that wasn't actually part of the Indian Act but was in force for over 100 years, could not leave the reserve without a pass from the Indian agent. Potlatch and other cultural ceremonies, wearing traditional regalia, practicing traditional religions were made illegal. Indians were also prohibited from forming political organizations or hiring legal counsel. Many of these provisions, which were added over time as the federal government sought to tighten its control, were in place until the 1950s, although most of them are gone now. Until 1960, a status Indian could not vote in a federal election. The one provision of the Act I'd like to talk about in more detail is enfranchisement. I know this story well because it is what happened in my family. My maternal grandparents, both status Indians in their own right, spent many years in a residential school run by the Anglican Church near Winnipeg. After the residential school, they married and lived mostly in northwestern Ontario, around Lac Seul and Sioux-Lookout, and occasionally back at the reserve. By the time my mother was born, they lived in Kenora, and our understanding is that my grandfather wanted to vote. So he enfranchised, and that meant that his wife and children were automatically enfranchised with him. My mother was born shortly after, so she never had status until 1985, when Bill C-31 allowed her to obtain it. She passed that status to me and my siblings, but we cannot pass it to our children. 2 years ago, I read about a man and his daughter who had taken the Department of Indian Affairs to court in Quebec because the daughter had been repeatedly denied status by the registrar, and it had to do with the enfranchisement of his mother. So I contacted the lawyer in that case. He gave me the name of a lawyer in British Columbia who was preparing a charter challenge based on a similar story to ours. I got in touch with that lawyer, Ryan Beaton, and the rest, as they say, is history. His basic argument, he explained to me, is that the enfranchisement provisions are discriminatory because only an Indian man could be enfranchised, and his wife had no option but to lose her status as well. That discrimination continues to this day, because if my grandmother had lost her status by marrying a non-Indian man, which she would have, then my mother would have obtained status that she could pass to her grandchildren. Enfranchisement puts my mother and me into one of those many Indian status categories that's just not equal. The research that Ryan did to obtain all of the information about my family includes a letter from the clerk of the Privy Council of Canada, who wrote the decisions about enfranchisement, about how upstanding and decent this particular Indian, my grandfather, was, and how he's thus deserved to stop being an Indian and become a citizen. It's been a long road occurring in the pandemic time, but Ryan persevered. In March of this year, Minister of Indigenous Services, Patty Hadju, announced that Canada would not go to trial with us on the enfranchisement issue and will introduce legislation to amend the registration provisions of the Indian Act sometime this summer. In her words, it will be as if the enfranchisement never occurred. Descendants of enfranchised Indians, like my family, will be entitled to the same registration as families with no history of enfranchisement. It's a tremendous victory, and one of which I am very proud. My mother, who died just before Christmas at the age of 96, was also a plaintiff, as were my children, and I know how pleased she would be. One of the most profound elements of this whole experience is hearing what my children have to say about their own lives, knowing that their grandmother is an Indian, but not feeling quite able to claim that heritage in the way they claim their Francophone heritage, or possibly a Norwegian heritage, if that's where my grandparents had come from. Canadians have always been proud of our multicultural approach to heritage, and it's common for people to talk about parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents who came here from faraway lands, and the meaning that that cultural connection continues to hold for them. Not so for the Indians. Language and culture outlawed, status as second or third class citizens who could not enjoy the rights and freedoms of other Canadians, targets of ignorance, discrimination, violence, and exclusion, not to mention the violation of the treaties and the theft of the land. It was not an easy thing to say, I am an Indian. So I stand before you today to say that I am an Indian, and that the heinous efforts of Canada to remove that identity from me and my family were not successful. In fact, every time the government rectified some of the most egregiously discriminatory parts of the Indian Act, they assumed that only limited numbers of people would even bother trying to claim or reclaim status, and they were caught by surprise each time at the number of applications that poured in. And that is because, despite how we were all, Indian and non-Indian alike, taught to dislike and disdain the Indians and expect, if not hope for, their disappearance, that identity is actually fundamental, meaningful, and continuing. There's a sense of identity that comes from being an Indian that has meaning, still meaning for people who have mostly been told for the last 150 years that their cultures, histories, languages, and even personhood have no relevance or are fundamentally inferior. It is true that the government created the Indians through the Indian Act, and that most First Nations and Inuit people identify through nation and community affiliation. I'm Cree, for example. But it is, in my mind, an act of self-determination, affirmation, and even resistance to say that, yes, I am an Indian, and an Indian I will remain. Those words help to destroy what Canada and many Canadians spent over 100 years trying to accomplish. And this has great significance for all of us in this land. As Indigenous people claim an equal and honored presence in Canada, so non-Indigenous people must let go of the former dominant narratives about how this country was founded, what being Canadian really means and what Canadians are really like, what really happened to and with the Indians, and how in the future we will share this land and the riches that flow from it. As we learn to take our roles as treaty partners seriously, we must be transformed. I'll leave you with a story that I think provides some sense of hope for our possible reconciled future in this land. It comes from a conversation I had a few weeks ago with a young woman who had just moved to Ottawa with her young family. She told me about her husband, whose late father was Ojibwe, and whose mother is of European origin. She explained that he'd grown up with no sense of cultural belonging, only the familiar and disheartening story of dysfunction, addiction, and violence. Now, she told me, he wants to try to learn more about his community and its traditions, and encourage his children to be proud of that part of who they are. That is what it means to be an Indian. And that reclamation will be the source of his own and our collective healing. Miigwech.